because Dan Glover is the author of the book, Deepening Your Effectiveness. And in the book, he describes 6 stages of Christian discipleship. But he does it based on the ocean. And the image is that the church is the ocean. And that sometimes in our discipleship we have our feet right at the surf, and sometimes we're deep enough in our discipleship that we're swimming with the whales. But the first stage of his journey of discipleship is when you're standing on the beach. You're standing on the beach and you're looking into the ocean that is the church. You're not part of it yet. You're not engaged in it yet. You're not moving in that discipleship journey yet. But you do have 2 questions as you look at the church. The first question is this faith real? Now think about that. From the outside in, is the faith real? And the second one is, does it make a difference? Is it real? And does it make a difference? Keep that in the back of your mind. In the Gospel according to Mark, the whole Gospel moves very, very rapidly. You will tell one story after another, and Mark is very fond of using the words immediately or upon that moment he went. It's a constant motion. We're at the 40th verse and Jesus had already done a couple healings. And none of them are the same. It hasn't been a magical formula or we have to do it this way. Each one is different because in each one, the person coming to him encounters the living Son of God in such a way that it transforms and recreates their lives, but it also begins to change the community. In this story, the leper has come to Jesus and has dropped on his knees and is begging, Lord, you can make me clean. You can heal me if you want. And the passage we read reads, and Jesus looked upon him with pity. Now, that's a fair translation, but it's not, in my mind, the best one. The best one is entirely different and will make us incredibly uncomfortable. And Jesus looked upon him with anger. Not at the man. Wasn't angry with him, but at the circumstance. The man is translated the leper, but it really means he had a skin disease. It could have been leprosy, could have been eczema, psoriasis, dandruff, or athlete's foot. They were all treated the same. And if you had any of those conditions, you were required, if you came in the presence of another person, to shout out, unclean! Unclean! So that everybody could stay away from it. You weren't allowed to go home. You weren't allowed to live with your family. You weren't even allowed to come into the village. People looked at you like you were a sinner, cast aside from the grace, the mercy, and the love of God because you had this condition. You weren't allowed in worship. You weren't allowed to speak to anyone. You weren't allowed to be in anyone's presence. Unclean. Abandoned, despised of God, or so they thought. This is the man who comes and kneels before Jesus and begs, if you desire, you can make me clean. And then Jesus does something extraordinary. He reaches out his hand and he touches the man. Imagine that, he touches him. Cast aside from home, family, from anybody in the community, and Jesus extends a hand and touches him. The first time he's had human contact, and who knows how long. Jesus reaches out and touches him and says, I do desire, be made clean. And he is healed of the skin affliction. But something else has happened. Something most folks don't think about. The fact that Jesus extended a hand and touched him before he healed him made Jesus unclean. He is now the same outcast as the man was before, simply because he touched him. Jesus chose to be among the outcast, the forgotten, the pushed aside, the irrelevant. He chose to be with them. Rudy Rasmussen is the pastor of St. John's United Methodist in Houston, Texas. Rudy is a little bit shorter than I am, a whole lot skinnier than I am, an African-American male that's always in jeans and a t-shirt. His beard is trimmed similar to mine on the sides, but when you get to the front, it's down to about this long, and it's braided with beads in it. And Rudy says this is my hypocrisy filter. Because anybody who looks at me, a black man in jeans with a beard like that, and doesn't want to talk to me, I probably don't want to deal with to begin with. They're judging him before they ever meet him. Unclean. Rudy pastors this church that when he arrived had 9 members and he brought 5 of them with him. It was located in the worst slum in Houston. It was in a slum that was so bad nobody wanted to come to church. But Rudy recognized there was a whole community around his church. It was the homeless. And it was the addicts. It was the alcoholics. And the folks too poor to get out. It was the prostitutes and the pimps and the gang members. And so Rudy opened the door. And the first thing they began was serving a meal to those who were hungry. But they didn't have a fellowship hall or even a space off the side. They had to have meals, and it was in the pews. And sometimes folks sat in the pew and ate, and sometimes they sat on the floor and used the pew as a table. But the first thing they understood was they are welcome and they were loved. And then Rudy went one step further. Guy came in homeless, reeking of being on the street and of alcohol. And when he came in, head down, shuffling along, Rudy reached out and gave him a hug and told him that God loved him. And the man began to weep. He didn't know he was still loved. And that became a tradition. Rudy embraced the addict shaking as he was going through withdrawal. He extended a hand to the woman who had sold her body the night before. He welcomed the gang members and their tax, but made it very clear that nothing happened in here that wasn't by the grace of God. And he began to show the unclean, the outcast, the forgotten, that God loves them and that God cares about them. The church now has 9,000 people in it. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white or rich. Yes, the wealthy folks, the politicians, celebrities, the poor, the homeless, the addicts. They're in one church, in one service. And it makes no difference who you are. You're going to get a hug when you come into that building, whether you want it or not. And you may be hugged by a guy that's been homeless on the street for years, or by one of the most wealthy folks in the city. They come to worship. The homeless, the needy, the abandoned, because they found what it is to be loved and treated as people who are precious in the sight of God. And the affluent and the powerful, because they look into the church and they see you. Remember those two questions? This love is real. And it makes a difference. Because those folks are loved just as they are, and loved too much to leave them there. You begin to see the rehab, the 12-step programs, the GED programs, the parenting programs, the things that allow folks to begin to strengthen and change their lives. They see the church as Christ intended the church to be. But we don't have to go to Houston. We don't have to go to Houston to find the outcast and those who were pushed aside. Donnie came to the house of the carpenter through the Bantam program. Bantam is the halfway house in Wheeling that most folks don't even know exists. For those who are transitioning out of the regional jail and prison, this is where they go as they begin to make the transition to go to parole. They try to get the folks employed, but the ones who can't get employed are required to do volunteer work. Donnie couldn't find the job, so he had to come to us as a volunteer. Donnie stood about this tall, African-American male, coming out of prison on a drug charge with dreadlocks well down past his shoulders. And it was funny. When Donnie walked in, you could see people step to the side. You could see people turn their heads and move away from him. People did not want to deal with him. Black, out of prison, drug charges, dreadlocks. He's scared. And they walked away from him. It's not hard for us to think of the outcasts that are around us. I can tell you where the low-income housing is for the folks who are hungry, and the kids don't know what they're going to have to eat tonight. I can tell you where most of the drug deals are going down in the community. I can tell you where the prostitutes are working. I can tell you where a lot of the ex-cons are. I can tell you where the sex offenders are. I can tell you, you can too, you know where these folks are. And how do we deal with it? We pretend they're not there. We cross to the other side of the street. We imagine that it can't make a difference. We would do it. We become, in many ways, that community that made Jesus angry. That community that forced him to extend his hand and touch an unclean man in order to be counted unclean himself, so those that were in need and desperate and hopeless could discover that God loved them. And that God welcomed them. And that God counted them precious. Donnie died about a month ago. A Vietnam vet, 2 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star. He died because we couldn't get him into the VA cemetery of the Alleghenies. He was not allowed a funeral service. He was not allowed prayer at the graveside because he had no family and he was poor. And people find that appalling. And it is. But what's more appalling is that nobody cared until after he was dead. We can walk the street today and we can recognize the folks that would have been the outcast in Jesus' day and in ours. And what do we say to them? How do we interact with them? How do we touch them? That's one question you have to answer. Because there's another group of folks that you're going to see in the grocery store and at the ball field and at work and at your neighbors and when you go to school. And these are the folks who have never been in the church. These are the folks who are standing on the beach. And they're looking at the church and they're asking, is this faith real and does it make a difference? You can say whatever you want. But the question is going to come down to what do you do? Do you extend the hand? And do you touch? And do you love as Christ has loved?